Hello, welcome to the dialogue between Princeton University and the University of Tokyo on perspectives on society after COVID-19. I am HANEDA Masashi, director of Tokyo College, the University of Tokyo, and play a role of moderator with Jim RAYMO of Princeton University. Hi, Jim. Princeton and UTokyo have a long history of collaboration in various fields. Especially since 2013, we have been conducting various activities, both in research and education, sending students, both undergraduate and graduate, to our partner, and of course, various joint research projects. We will call this partnership a strategic partnership. And if you want to know more about the history of our partnership, please watch the first video of the whole series. We planned dialogues of this time on the basis of our long partnership. The faculties of two universities will exchange ideas and opinions, information on their specific research field, and discuss on society after COVID-19 from various perspectives. Today we have wonderful two great experts of international affairs, Professor FUJIWARA Kiichi from the University of Tokyo and Professor John IKENBERRY from Princeton University. Let me introduce at first briefly the career of Professor FUJIWARA. Professor FUJIWARA Kiichi is a professor at the graduate schools for law and politics. He is also affiliated with Institute for Future Initiative at the University of Tokyo and played the role of its director till last March. He studied international politics as a Fulbright student at Yale University. And then after that, he has been visiting various universities, US universities, and a lot of have had a lot of joint research projects with his American colleagues, including, of course, Professor John IKENBERRY at Princeton. He has taught at the graduate schools for law and politics since 1999. He is a very popular regular commentator on international affairs at various Japanese medias, televisions, and newspapers, including the monthly column at Asahi Shimbun, the major Japanese newspaper. I know that he's a great amateur of cinema, and he even writes a weekly cinema review at the Mainichi newspaper. Well, Jim, could you introduce Professor IKENBERRY?
Sure. Thank you, Masashi. Before that, I would like to, briefly reiterate that my name is Jim RAYMO at Princeton. I'm in the sociology department and now the director of the strategic partnership on this side at Princeton. And what I'd like to say is really how enjoyable this has been, not only to be the sidekick to Masashi here as one of the moderators, but also to have this really amazing opportunity to meet virtually and hopefully more in person my colleagues here at Princeton and colleagues at the University of Tokyo, and to simply sit and learn about their expertise in a range of areas that are of obvious interest to all of us, but in which we have relatively little actual expertise. So this has really been a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to tonight. And particularly to introducing my colleague here at Princeton, Professor John IKENBERRY, who is a professor of politics and international affairs in the politics department and the School for Public and International Affairs here at Princeton. And he's one of the world's leading scholars in the field of international affairs. And if you don't believe me, just take a look at his CV and you'll see an incredible amount of really high profile, extremely important publications, including a number of books related to the past, present, and future of international relations, or the world order or global order more broadly. And from my perspective as in this position, and from our perspective as representatives of the strategic partnership, really important is the fact that although John's work is tremendously broad and, as I mentioned, covers essentially the world, or the developed world in particular, he has done quite a bit of work on Japan, working with Japanese colleagues, thinking about and writing about Japan's position in the world, and looking forward to hearing a little bit about that tonight in broader context. And one other thing that I think really bears mentioning, and I said I'm a sociologist, and we like to think that we have some role in the policy dialogue, but often we really don't. So it's incredibly impressive to see the kinds of active participation in the actual policy arena that have characterized John's career. 2 stints in the Department of State, just to start. I could go on and on, but you get the idea. You know, somebody who is, as I said, at the forefront not only of the discipline from an academic perspective, but also in the policy arena as well. So welcome, John. Welcome, Kiichi. Thank you both for taking the time to join us tonight. We are this morning or tonight, wherever you are. We really appreciate it. So back to you, Masashi.
Thank you, Jim. So let me start the dialogue. At first, I'd like to ask both of you to give your perspective on the state of world politics in the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic. Could you introduce your point of view briefly in 5-7 minutes on this question? How has the pandemic impacted international relations, and what might its long-term legacy be for cooperation and great power relations? Who will start? Maybe John?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Masashi and Jim. And it's great to be with you and to be with my old friend, Kiichi, who I must say we've been partners for a long time. We've I think if we count the years, we've been working together in various bilateral and multilateral academic settings for 13 or 14 years. And so we've actually been able to together kind of witness and think about and process world politics over the last several decades, trying to make sense of the tumultuous times that we live in. And I would just say, to get started, that this is an extraordinary moment, a world historical moment. The world has been turned upside down, a sense of transition, of crisis, a breakdown rather than building, of endings rather than beginnings. And I think we don't know where things will go, but we do have a sense that we are in multiple unfolding crises. And I would say there are 3 crises that are unfolding, each of which has been exacerbated by the COVID crisis. So my answer to the question, what has COVID done to the world, will be that it's exacerbated, it's accelerated, it's amplified dynamics that are larger and ongoing. And 3 in particular. One is what I'll call a geopolitical crisis. The world is in a grand transition, really, from an American-centered, Western-ordered world to one where China is increasingly bidding for influence. And we'll talk about that tonight. A power transition is the way that we describe it in the study of international relations. The order built by one or a group of states giving way to challengers that are rising up, becoming powerful, becoming wealthy, having increasing global interests, and thereby pushing themselves into the world, seeking to protect those interests, to advance those interests. So a crisis of geopolitics, and it's a kind of a triple crisis, in the sense that it's a transition from the United States to China, from the West to Asia, and from capitalist democracy to socialism. So it's multifaceted. The second crisis I would call the crisis of modernity. This is the crisis of our global age of interdependence, driven by cascades of economic, security, and environmental entanglements. The COVID crisis is the epitome of it, that we are all endangered by each other, increasingly at further distance and with greater lethality. The Anthropocene age that we are entering, the planetary environmental crisis, which is huge and not fully registered politically, although as we watch the world leaders assembled in the last few days to talk about the environment, we know that it's increasingly coming to the top of the agenda. The third crisis is what I would call the crisis of liberal democracy, that the old Western liberal democracies that seem to be a model for the world, that seem to be the kind of byproduct of historical developments that were generating answers to the question, how can countries best be governed? That those countries that seem to be the answer to that grand question no longer seem to be the answer, that they are polarized, they're unequal, their institutions are less legitimate, they are kind of coming apart at the seams, including the United States, driven by nationalism and tribalism and ideological culture wars and racial reckoning. So these three crises are simultaneous and they are interactive, and they each are, in some sense, feeding on each other. And so I, as a scholar of international relations, I take pause from this. I think that we are at a moment where we can't take very much for granted, that we have to ask fundamental questions yet again. We have to remember the days when we read the most basic tracts of political theory about the world, from Hobbes, Thucydides, debated the great theories of international relations from liberals and realists. So I think we're at that kind of moment of asking the most basic questions about what is international order, how can it be built, and how can liberal democracies survive as they weaken and become increasingly entangled in a world of illiberalism.
Thank you very much, John. And it's your turn, Kiichi, please.
Thank you, Haneda Sensei, and thank you, John. And I very much appreciate being able to attend this dialogue. John and I have been working together on several occasions during the past decade, or more than a decade. And the Princeton-Tokyo partnership was immensely important for personal reasons, as well as my colleagues and the graduate students, many of whom are already young scholars with tenure position now. We're in a time of crisis, to be sure, with COVID-19, the pandemic affecting people across borders. You can't really ask viruses to stay within national boundaries. It just doesn't work that way. But nonetheless, the reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic has been essentially national in character, compared to, say, Ebola, for example, where we saw a pretty active participation of WHO. We didn't see that in the current crisis management. And one of the reasons is that, well, the Chinese government was not willing to come out with open information. And we can't merely put the blame on China, because many advanced industrial democracies were also depending on their own capacity in facing the crisis. As you can see in the European Union, this was a shameful moment for the EU. So most of the initiatives that took place took more than half a year, actually, to build a joint response. And that goes for the East Asian region as well. We don't see much international collaboration between South Korea, which was heavily affected after China, or for that matter, Japan. The Japanese, quite unfortunately, were happy that they were not affected as much as the Chinese or Koreans. That is not an attitude that helps international collaboration. Has it made any changes in the world, in the global order? And here I agree with John's points that we see an acceleration of crisis. The question is whether it started with COVID-19. What we see, I think, is COVID-19 working as an accelerator of what has been taking place for some time. John just used the word power transition, and this is a word many of us in international studies use when there is a major shift in the balance of power, and when the hegemonic power loses its relative position to power that catches up. This is an old concept. And we try to, disregard it. After the end of the Cold War, we thought that we won't really have to talk about it. The world comes back with a vengeance in early 21st century. And we've been discussing about this before COVID-19. And of course, we're talking about the rise of China. And then the COVID crisis accelerated such movement in at least 3 ways. In terms of geopolitics, we see a crisis between China and the world becoming more serious than before. We also see that in the economic sphere, where the supply chain has changed dramatically. The division of labor, the site of manufacturing production, and the chain that brings all those activities together is changing quite rapidly with China at the center. And then there's yet another element. The movement of people has been restricted extremely heavily for obvious reasons. This has been a challenge to us working in university because, students can't really go to the places where they were admitted. University of Tokyo students are stranded overseas, and I believe that that was the case in many other societies as well. But more generally, free movement of people was restricted, and that itself was a big change. And here I'd like to bring back the old word that we're not using so often these days, and that's globalization. And after the end of the Cold War, globalization became more than an academic concept. It was a word that describes cross-national movement of capital, goods, and people, which was also supposed to lead to building of institutions in the world. Even if there is no world federation or world government, if there are shared interests and very possibly shared ideas about societies, we can promote common institutions, and that would be democracy. And John did point out about this crisis of democracy as one of the challenges we see today. And this is also about capitalism, that the world market becoming more integrated than before would lead to new opportunities that allow growth along with more dependable legal institutions that govern the market. Let me put it that way. Its relationship with inequality was quite doubtful, actually. This is a time of neoliberalism, but nonetheless, there was supposed to be more order in the market. So there was a time when we talked about globalization, and we still do talk about globalization, but right now we more often talk about trends against globalization, trends against free movement of capital, and trends against free movement of goods, and trends against, well, global political institutions, whether geopolitical or economic. And that is another picture, side of the issue that John has just illustrated. Even though COVID-19 may not have produced a new idea about the global society, it has certainly accelerated the movement against what we took for granted, and that is globalization. I should stop here.
Thank you very much, Fujiwara Sensei. Maybe you can discuss each other, but for me, it's an irony because the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis is certainly, it's a pandemic, so it's international. But Fujiwara Sensei told us the crisis is mainly national. We try to solve the question within the framework of nation. It's a great irony for me. Anyway, please start to discuss each other at first. Ask questions, make comments.
Well, I'll ask a question to Kiichi really about, let's spend a little time thinking about the legacy effect of COVID. I think we both agree that it has a kind of accelerator, exacerbator effect, that it's taking trends that are already troubling and destabilizing and making them worse. Just to think out loud a little bit, I think that's true. I think we're kind of surprised that this didn't create a kind of we're all in it together moment. That we're better off working together. I think in some sense it's not that surprising in that we have had this ongoing rivalry between the US and China, and the US saw this as a China threat initially. The Wuhan virus sort of instrumentalized as a part of geopolitics. But I do think that this is partly a statement and then a question to Kiichi, that there will be some long-term effects on the other side of the ledger. I think there probably will be quietly, slowly, some rebuilding of international capacity to deal with pandemics. The WTO has been kind of decimated. The US even remarkably, shockingly withdrew, Trump withdrew from the WHO in the middle of the pandemic. But I think the US has returned. There will be it will be filtered through the geopolitical prism, but there will be international efforts to strengthen our capacities for monitoring, surveillance, and response. It will be contentious in various ways. Norms of transparency, for example, which seem to be absolutely necessary, will ruffle the feathers of China. They already have. They don't want to open their doors to scrutiny. We're going to have to find a way to strengthen our ability to monitor and respond to these crises. So I think there'll be some multilateral institutional response. But the second response that I can't really give an evidence for this, but I think that this crisis has been so dramatic, with several million people already dead, and the sense that it's not really going to go away, that it's kind of a permanent pandemic at one level or another. And it's very easy to see another variant coming up. And there we go again. We're back to our period of protecting and pulling back. But the global imaginary, the way that we and our children think about the world as a vulnerable, shrinking blue dot moving through space, a sense that spaceship Earth, planet Earth, as a kind of more vulnerable place that is generating existential threats to our civilizations. Somehow, in the long term, ideas seem to have longer lasting effects than particular policies or dramatic diplomatic moments. But the way that our children will talk about this to their children, the way that the global imaginary for what kind of world do we live in, I think that will change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Kiichi?
I hate to agree with you. I want to disagree, but actually I appreciate John for bringing up hope in this time of crisis, and I do agree. For one thing, WHO, international regime concerning pandemic, they were well equipped to face breakout of diseases in the global south. And they were facing Ebola on an international cooperative basis that they were pretty much well prepared for. SARS was yet another outbreak. The Chinese government was initially quite reluctant, but then started work very well with WHO. And it didn't really happen that the largest number of patients would be in the United States or United Kingdom, or for that matter, Spain or Brazil. And the basic underlying assumption that advanced industrial democracies, the richest and the powerful nations in the globe, would not be hard hit by pandemics. It simply didn't work that way here. And this challenges the underlying assumption about international organizations. We tend to think that the United Nations work for the globe. Yes, the issue is global, but most of their activities is in the global south. About 70% of UN and its special institutions budget goes to Africa, where there is great need for such activities. The other side of this assumption that international cooperation is most necessary in the global south is that the global north, well, you can take care of yourself. And also they have the power to block any initiative that come from the outside. The borderline states were the emerging economies where there is strong state capacity, strong enough to block international assistance or intervention, but nonetheless would eventually open up. And the assumption is that UK or US would always be open, and then Japan is close to that club. And that assumption is no longer there. And this may be a good thing, actually, because we can talk about international cooperation in the real true sense. The work of WHO should not only be targeted to the global south. And on this, one thing that I have learned as working as a university apparatchik is that, well, we have chances to work with natural scientists. And that includes both Japanese and American, British, and Chinese. The landscape, the community, and I found there when they discuss about COVID-19 is totally different. I guess, I hope I'm not too conservative, but I felt I really was thinking in terms of nation states and political boundaries, even though I am opposed to that in many ways. There really is no boundaries, and there's a competition for new knowledge. and well, new achievements, but nonetheless, they're working together. And then there was cross-national sharing of the assumption that information should be open to academics. And this was the wonderful impression I got from, I received from just sitting in the discussion about COVID-19, that natural scientists facing pandemic truly have a cross-national community, and they are very active in constructing a world after COVID right now. So, John, I do not doubt that there will be an institution building after this, taking this opportunity. Well, opportunity is not really the best word. Taking this calamity as the starting point for building an institution. And that I should stretch this to global warming too. Now, my colleagues working on sustainability, global sustainability, has been telling me over the years that no, you shouldn't be talking about China or United States or geopolitics. We should be talking about global warming. That was, well, convincing. So when I was the director at the Institute for Future Initiatives, we put SDGs and global sustainability as the A1 issue that we should work on. And again, I could see that natural scientists have a sense of community that is quite different from ours. Yes, we have a community. I mean, we have academic association, of course, but an almost total disregard of the national boundaries in the discussion about global warming was an eye-opener for me.
Yeah, yeah.
You carry on, please.
No, go ahead and finish your thought. I wanted to respond to that last point about how the study of international relations has found it very hard to grapple with global warming because it doesn't fit kind of our categories and our agendas.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It doesn't fit. It's a terrible thing to say, really. I do discuss about global warming. I discuss about sustainability in my classes, but I always had this feeling that that section is almost independent from the whole course, really. And I think well, international studies may be becoming a dinosaur, really, compared to such cross-national academic community. But nonetheless, we do have a work cut out for us, because after all, if individual governments do not act, nothing's going to happen. And when it comes to
absolutely.
And that's where we jump in, right? And that is what is happening with COP26, I believe. It's so easy to agree on the principles, and zero carbon is now principle that has been agreed by powers, including China and Japan, both not very well known for taking initiative in sustainability, but well, there's an agreement. When it comes to implementation, that's a different matter, and that's where political scientists might jump in. A very long answer to your point. Back to you, John.
Yeah, I think I just echo what Kiichi said about the difficulties of in the scholarly world of international relations to make sense of, to bring global warming, the politics of climate change into the classroom, into our academic studies, because it's such a complex and difficult to pin down phenomenon in many ways. Number one, the causal connections between cause and effect. What are the causes of global warming? They're so diverse and aggregated. And what are the effects? They're so multiple and diverse that it's hard to define it in one way as a dependent variable that you can regress with independent variables. Secondly, it's a long-standing unfolding phenomenon. It seems to be coming faster than we thought, but people talked about 2050 or 2060 as that's when the real crunch is going to come, when southern Florida will give way. It won't just be Miami; it will be Orlando. So it's a long-term phenomenon that is not a crisis in a temporal sense. Thirdly, it's a crisis that's going to affect poor countries more than rich countries. Quite frankly, the poor countries are going to suffer, whether it's climate refugees, whether it's agricultural crises, and so forth. And then fourthly, it's experienced more generally in different ways in different places. So there's not a general threat. It's broken into many different pieces. It's if you will, it's experienced differently in different places. So it's hard to grapple with using our traditional tools. But it's here and it's in our midst. And I hope that we can find a way to bring it into our diplomacy. We're going to be spending some time thinking about whether this the most recent meeting in Glasgow is going to have an impact. What it doesn't sound like there's any breakthrough. We're going to see countries making pledges that are really so out year. India now is pledging 2070 for carbon neutrality. It's almost a different world that you're kind of punting into the next world. You're not really, that's a way of saying we're not going to be able to grapple with it in our lifetime. So that's pretty depressing to see, but that's you can explain it. That's the reality.
As a teacher of international studies, and if scholars in international relations disregard global warming, we would lose the support from the students. There is a generational aspect here. The younger generation pay much stronger attention to the issue of global warming because, well, the dismal future is much closer to their lives. And there's a generational factor in political mobilization on this issue as well. I still remember going to London 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, actually, when there was much debate about Brexit, and of course, I was assuming that Londoners are talking about Brexit. And instead, what I observed was a major demonstration against global warming taking place in London. This was almost like the days of anti-nuclear public demonstrations in early 1980s. Cross-generation, but especially the younger generation participating in this. There was a time when politicians chose to neglect environmental issues and put it on the back burner. And some of them would even say that there is no thing as global warming, and that goes to a number of populist leaders in the world. Japan is no exception here, actually. No prime ministers, fortunately, though. I don't think they can take this position anymore because the hazard has become quite obvious. And the severity of climate, severity of changes in the climate has become a political issue that cannot be disregarded. Having said that, how much are the governments willing to pay to remedy the situation is an open question, of course. Yeah. So They might agree on the question and the principle, but their action might be not be inappropriate. Having said that, this is one thing that the Chinese and the American governments can agree upon these days. Very few issues are shared between Beijing and Washington right now, but environment is an area that that both nations will try to work on. How far they would go is, I don't know.
Well, you've opened up the big question of U.S.-China relations. I agree with you that they both are going to suffer from the results of climate change. So they both have a incentive to work together. China, emits 24% of the world's carbon on an annual basis, not the overall stock. The United States has put more carbon in the air than any other country, but on a current year-to-year basis, China is the big emitter. The United States is number 2, 17%. So between them, they're really 42% of world carbon emissions is coming from these two countries. So they, at the very least, if you think of what two countries can have the most capability of having the greatest impact, those would be the two countries, the biggest bang for the buck, as we used to say. So the underlying interests are there, and they're interests that are not. We used to think that if one country would only do it if the other country did, but there's a slight kind of evolution of that logic that each, in some sense, has an absolute interest, independent of what the other country does. That each has the capacity to make a difference. And again, I think when we ask ourselves, how can China and the United States come together? One additional ingredient that I play with as a possibility is, in this time of what we might call superpower rivalry, the rise of a two superpower world, the rise of two leading states, each wanting to dominate, to be top dog, to be the leader. The US wants to stay on top, China wants to get on top. We call this hegemony. President Xi has made it clear that he's no longer going to defer to a world has a hierarchy that is defined by American power and American partners, the liberal democratic world. He said recently that China can now, he was bragging to Chinese officials in a meeting in Beijing, that we can now look at the world on an equal landscape, on an equal playing field, that we're no longer looking up at America, we can look directly at America. So this hegemonic competition is for, I will argue tonight, going to be one of the defining features of world politics for the next 20 years, hegemonic rivalry. But that rivalry, of course, can be very dangerous. But part of what it means to be a hegemon, as opposed to simply being an empire, is that it matters what other people think of you. Hegemony is leadership, so you need followers. You need those who will bandwagon, who will acquiesce, who will want to join, who will want to be inside of your orbit. So with that in mind, China and the United States both have an incentive to be what I would call global problem solvers. Part of what gives you legitimacy to be the top dog is that you are offering the world solutions to problems. You are doing things like the US used to think it did. A financial crisis, the US would step forward and provide countercyclical financing, open its markets, use ideological persuasion, and so forth. The United States has kind of stopped doing that. That's part of the crisis, that the US has not been it's been lighting fires as opposed to putting out fires. but the point I'm making is that if China and the United States are in a kind of rivalry where the winner partly wins by being virtuous, by being a problem solver, we might see the US and China trying to be the first country to be carbon neutral, to dominate solar, to use the next generation of technology for purposes of generating a kind of sustainable development, these kinds of things. So I'm prepared to think that could happen, even though it's a bit of a long shot. But I think that there's a possibility for that kind of dynamic to emerge. What do you think, Kiichi?
That's a very good competition, really. I mean, if the United States and China compete on each other and construct major developments in climate change, that'd be great. One thing that we have to remember when we talk about hegemony, a very simple point: empires are costly. You may be able to occupy naval bases, occupy a certain city, Malacca, perhaps, but when you start to impose territorial rule, the cost of administration itself is already too much. And the strength of American power, American democracy or capitalism, was that it was essentially what Gallagher and Robinson called imperialism free trade. Instead of insisting on direct administration, colonial administration, the United States was content to agree to political independence so long as they follow liberal international trade and open up their market, and also allow coal stations, if not naval bases. Now, this of course was not that easy to sustain, and it has its own limits, to say the least. But the Chinese are now, exposed to this situation. They have an immense economic power, and their military capability is rising. And whether this will translate into political influence is the major issue. I have an impression that more nations are supportive of China because of economic opportunities, and not because they are afraid about Chinese military power. I don't deny that the Chinese government has been using some blackmailing techniques to certain powers. That ugly dimension should not be disregarded. But essentially, the Chinese were successfully pulling support from a large number of nations because China is a major economy. And the investment on public infrastructure would be welcome. In other words, they are not willing to give up national sovereignty to China. And whenever there's a chance that their powers are controlled by Chinese naked political intervention, as we can see in the case of ASEAN nations, suddenly they stand up together and block Chinese influence. So China may be a major power, but it's not really working in the way as in the traditional colonial empires. If China was humiliated in the past, it doesn't follow that China should reconstruct Ming Dynasty. And also I should add that Ming Dynasty was not a territorial state. It was based on one of the largest expansion of free trade in the region, with pirates and all. Just reading the whole history in terms of nation states in Ming Dynasty is a major mistake, I should say. Frankly, I do not think Chinese economic or military capacity will translate easily into political influence. This means that they will have to work on leadership but not domination. Leadership needs followers.
I agree with that. Absolutely. I think that one of the things that follows from that point is that when countries are superpower, have superpower, global power, military, economic capabilities, their political influence depends a great deal on the character of their domestic regime, not just on the formidable, how formidable their external power is. And so I've thought a lot about this in terms of the US and some of the work I hope to do in the years ahead on comparing US and Chinese hegemony. The late great scholar John Ruggie, in his argument about American hegemony, said the important point to remember that what made it such a successful order after World War II was that it was not American hegemony, but it was American hegemony. That is to say, it was not the hegemony as in power that mattered. It was that the United States brought its own distinctive institutions to the project of leadership, which means open, democratic, capable of being penetrated by the outside. People could look in and see Washington. The US had lots and lots of allies, over 50, 60 countries that are tied to the United States for security. It tied itself to the world through agreement to operate inside of all these different economic, political, and military institutions. So there was an American style of hegemony that played well in the world. People wanted more American leadership, not less. Even though the US abused its power in many ways, it covertly, the CIA and abusive and indeed imperial type of military intervention. So we don't need to sugarcoat the American story, but there was something functional in the US role in the world, balancing against Russia and China. That's still very much America's role. Those who want America to come home, to reduce America's role as a superpower, for me, it really is a invitation for the further encroachment of Russian and Chinese imperial ambition. So I don't think we want the US to fail or to shrink entirely. And in that spirit, just to kind of wrap this up, I do wonder whether China can see that its own success on the global stage is tied to how it treats its own people. What it does in Hong Kong is being read in Taiwan. It's being read in San Francisco. So I think there are incentives for both countries to get their act together, clean up their act at home, and try to build decent institutions for themselves and thereby for the world.
Please allow me to intervene in your very interesting dialogue, because the time is now running up. Let's discuss a little bit about Japan. We are just after the Japanese general election. How do you evaluate the result of Japanese election of this time? Maybe Kiichi-san first.
I really don't want to answer that question.
Why?
My reaction would be that it's pretty dismal. It's not the first time that this happened. The Liberal Democratic Party, the ruling party that has governed Japan more or less since 1955 with very, very limited exception, and changed its course. Prime Minister Suga was losing public support. His response to COVID-19 was terrible, to say the least. And then they chose a new leader, Kishida, and somehow that carried the day. But it's even worse. The opposition party, which support the Article 9 of the Constitution, run into trouble, because if you try to do that, you're working with the Communist Party, and the Communist Party has very strong institution in each district. So actually, you are giving away your party structure to the Japanese Communist Party, and that led to further divisions in the opposition camp. Now there is a huge political vacuum, and that political vacuum was occupied by Ishin, which I assure you is worse than LDP. But I've been living in this country for so long, and if there's anything that we can count on, is that the Kishida is not an Abe. And Abe was a combination of historical revisionism and realist foreign policy. And Kishida is more moderate liberal. He's like Rockefeller Republican, really. And he's not taking foreign policy for domestic consumption. And that's the good thing that I can say about Kishida. Talking with Professor IKENBERRY always led me to find something that I can hope for in a time of difficulty. And I think it's because of his influence that I'm finding some hope at the end of the road in this political dismal situation that we place after the election.
What is your view, Jean, from outside of Japan on the election, last election?
Well, I always rely on Kiichi, so I sort of have relied on him to tell me what to think. You know, I don't have any disagreement with him. I think that in some ways Japan has been a very reliable state in the world system, and one that taking the long view has been extraordinarily important for upholding the features of the international order that we want to preserve and extend, starting from the support for the United Nations, for its vision on sustainable development, on anti-nuclearism, the Hiroshima legacy. There's an amazing Japanese story, and I think that sometimes in the superpower give and take, we forget how important Japan is as a state that has used its position between Asia and the West, between the North and the South, to push in the right directions. I just am so impressed by that, generally speaking, and each Japanese leader is a little bit different. Abe, you know, I had my moments of nothing like my moments of terror when I look at the White House and I see this guy with orange hair looking at the camera saying the most bewildering things. But Abe bringing a little bit of that kind of historical revisionism that Kiichi talked about, that always gives me a little tinge of worry. But I think on balance, we should be grateful that Japan is operating at such a high level on the world stage, and we hope that will be the case for the next cycle of history.
Thank you very much. There are many other things to discuss, certainly, I believe, between you, but the time is now up, and I hope we'll have another opportunity to discuss these issues in the near future. Thank you very much for your cooperation, and see you soon.
Thank you both very much. This was wonderful. 1 hour on a Zoom meeting goes by this quickly and leaves us wanting more. That's a sure sign of success. So I really appreciate it.
You had no chance to intervene, Jim.
Sorry about that, Jim.
No, this is beautiful. I get to sit back and listen and learn.
Yeah, me too.
I mentioned at the beginning that I'm interested in these things as an outsider. I feel a lot of concern and uncertainty, and you've helped to convince me that I should be feeling that, but you've also helped to clarify it a bit. So I really appreciate this. It's been fantastic from my perspective, and I certainly imagine that those who watch this will feel the same as I have. So really do appreciate your joining us tonight. Thank you.
One thing I would like to tell you is that how to compromise national and global. This is certainly a very important issue, not only international affairs, but also many other fields. That is certain. Okay, thank you very much. And bye-bye.
Thank you both.